Well, the Eastern Cape's winter initiation season is upon us, and authorities are preparing to crack down on illegal initiation schools and unregistered traditional surgeons. The Eastern Cape Customary Male Initiation Practice Act will be, at least was enforced for the first time last season, and imposes a 20,000 Rand fine or up to a year in jail for any school that operates without the permission from the MEC of Health in the province and approval from local traditional leaders. Some visuals there giving you a sense of what it's like on the ground. So the question we're asking tonight is, what lessons have been learnt in the last year, and is this legislation helping to prevent the maiming and deaths of initiates? We're joined now by Mr. Obed Bapela, the Deputy Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. Good evening to you, and thank you for talking to us this evening.
Good evening.
Every year we read of the horror deaths of initiates, and we see very young people sometimes getting maimed. Are we making any progress in terms of preventing injuries and the loss of life?
We are making progress, though any one death is too many. But we have reduced from 3 digits as in the past 5 years. Now we are talking about deaths that can go up to 2 digits only and no longer above 40, particularly in the Eastern Cape. Last year in winter season, only 11 died as a result of the fire also that affected one of the schools where children were burned inside there. About 8 children died. So if that fire did not occur, we'll be talking of Eastern Cape having 3 in winter season. However, the summer season became worse because of dehydration, heat at that time, and people not taking water. And a lot of deaths that happened, around 25, was as a result of dehydration. So we'll have to look at all those things, not only what the schools are doing, but also to ensure that everything that is needed in the school is there.
Yeah, because it's not just about the surgical procedures. As you point out, there are often shortages of basic provisions like food, like water, and sometimes even adequate accommodation. How are you dealing to make sure that there's some kind of minimum standards for how these schools operate?
Well, definitely we'll have to look at that using the new law in the Eastern Cape, but we are also coming up with the national law, which is now before the standing portfolio committees in Parliament, which will, as soon as it's ready, it will be a wider law that looks at all provinces, how you establish a school. There must be exit points, have many exit points, because what happened in the Eastern Cape, they were all rushing towards the same door and they got locked, and then it then bent, and it's made up of grass, and sometimes it's plastic, and once it melts, obviously, you get choked and then you die a terrible death.
But there are also cultural issues to negotiate. Often the initiates themselves don't have much of a voice in terms of how, the structure of what happens there. They're not always able to object to particular treatment. They may be asked to go without food or water for certain periods, and they're not able to object. How are you dealing with the cultural sensitivities that make it difficult for initiates to speak for themselves, for example?
Yeah, definitely it's adults who are running these schools, some through the permission of the traditional leaders. Where there's no traditional leader, the municipalities must be on the board and make sure that these things are happening. But you find that some adults, unfortunately, they are allowing all sorts of things to happen in the school. Drugs will enter the schools. Alcohol also was the biggest problem last year, where you find that bottles and bottles of whatever liquor that you can think of is there, children getting drunk, and all sorts of things that are happening in there, which are not supposed to, because culture, it says, after the circumcision, then you get taken through the process and of passage to adulthood. You get lessons on cultural values, you get lessons about Ubuntu, you get lessons about who you are and how you to be in a community that we're going to be going back to.
But quite often we've seen examples where initiates were physically stressed, not able to get access to basic provisions and not able to speak up. It seems to me that the system is set up in a way that places enormous trust on those who operate these schools without necessarily always protecting the vulnerable.
Well, obviously, to some extent, you are correct. However, we have asked the parents to really to come and be part of the collective. And on those single families which are headed by women, the uncles must also rise, because there are uncles in an African society that used to be the guardians of these particular children. So that now and then they visit the schools. They look as to whether everything is in place.
Is government going to do those inspections and not just leave it up to the families?
We leave them to the families, unfortunately, because it's the family members that goes there. And then when it comes to government, it's only the traditional nurses or the nurses that are trained as nurses in hospital, but they must be males, who themselves have been from mountain. They must go and inspect these children as to whether they are coping with the hardship, they are healing very well, and there are no problems.
So do you have the personnel that would go and do spot checks unannounced to make sure that everything is above board?
Yes, we do have the Kwalideng Goma forums in Mpumalanga, and then in the Eastern Cape, they just call them initiation forums. In the Eastern, so they have their own names, and they are a group of men who are volunteering to also ensure, therefore, that they inspect all the schools.
The message of government has been around zero deaths, and that's what you're saying again this evening. But of course, it's going to require a lot more than just tough talk. What actions are you taking against those operators who don't meet the law's requirements?
Well, the Eastern Cape has just initiated a law last year, and already somebody was sentenced to 18 years this year for such an illegal activity in the where accused of murdering. Because when you look at the case itself, it was pure murder. So we hope, therefore, more and more of such cases must go through the courts using the new law. And the national law is also coming to say any illegal school, whether there's death or there's injury or there's nothing, so long as an illegal school, will then be sentenced to 5 years for just creating or opening a school without permission.
A controversial one, perhaps, but also necessary to ask. What do you say to those people who say the protection of lives should have greater primacy than the preservation of culture, and that outside of a clinical environment, surgical procedures such as we see in initiation schools should be outdated?
Well, look, culture is there to be preserved, but our culture must also adapt to the new conditions. It must adapt to new development. And as is the case with this practice, during the Stone Age, the only weapon that was available was a stone. Now we went to Iron Age, and as a guy, then became the tool. Now today we talk of invention now, and then I think we need to look at that and say, well, how and where the culture should adapt without assimilating it, because the UNESCO says we should not assimilate other people's cultures. But that culture, if it kills, if that culture is going to lead to amputations, if that culture is going to injure, then the government cannot stand on the side and do nothing.
This is why the argument is brought in that at least as far as the clinical aspects of the procedures, those should be done in a clinical environment. I mean, there are a number of problems that arise that can only be dealt with, for example, in a proper hospital. Things like wound care, for example, that can only really be dealt with in a hospital. The sterility of the implements that are used is often a problem. So all these complications, where no other surgical procedure of this kind is allowed outside of a clinical environment, there are those who ask, why are we continuing to allow this?
Well, we have mobile clinics now. They can even go into the forest and be set up there. In Limpopo, in Mpumalanga, they have already started. That's why the death rates, out of 20,000 in Limpopo last year, 0 death. In Mpumalanga, out of 40,000, only 3. But these 3 came from illegal schools. Eastern Cape is still very tough area for any negotiation. Traditional leaders are not budging on the issue, but we are talking to them that it's about time to adapt, because today's illnesses are too complicated for anybody. Allow for these mobile clinics with the people that themselves were former initiates. They were from London, but they are now educated, they are medical doctors and so forth, who will then take care of that particular procedure, plus the care of the wound. And new traditional leaders continue with their training of culture, traditions, and those customary issues.
So ultimately it's about creating dialogue and making sure that everyone shares the same vision.
Yeah, and the Eastern Cape is the most difficult area, but we are talking to the traditional leaders about
0 deaths. Let's hope that's what the number is at the end of this winter season too. Thank you very much.
I just hope Somabaye bephila, babuye bephilile. And I think that is our message.
Indeed. That was Obed Babela, the Traditional Affairs and Cooperative Governance Deputy Minister. Now, the former Vice President of the Democratic Republic